Well, there are points in history, there are events, perhaps we could call them, that change the course, that change the direction of nations, that change the direction of societies. Pivotal points in the history of nations that are momentous. Such pivotal points often come at the end of a war. Treaties are signed that set the stage for a new era. Like what happened on the 2nd of September in 1945 under the eye of General MacArthur with the end of World War II. A treaty was signed, many of you may know of it, on board that ship, the USS Missouri. That was a momentous meeting of national leaders. It was a pivotal point in the history of the nations involved, including ours, and it opened up a new era. Such points are momentous events in the life of any given people. And we come this morning to one such event, to the meeting of great historical figures at the end of a war. It's not to General MacArthur, it's not to General Blamey of Australia or to Shigemitsu, the Japanese foreign minister who was also on board that ship. But we find here in Genesis 14 the returning, victorious Abram. We find Berean, king of Sodom. And we find Melchizedek, king of Salem. Abram, sometimes called the father of the faithful. And Abram points us to the true believer, the one who has faith. Berean, king of Sodom, obviously points us to the world, or the worldling, he who is enslaved to his sin and lives only for this world. And this mysterious character, Melchizedek, who points us to Jesus Christ, the great priestly king of his people. Three significant figures in Bible history come to us here in this passage, but two in particular, two of them are momentous characters in the unfolding of the history of redemption for the people of God. Those, of course, being Abraham and Melchizedek. So as we return this morning to Genesis 14, we're coming not so much to the series that we have been looking at in the life of Lot, but we're coming to glean some thoughts, especially around the character of Melchizedek, before we partake of the Lord's Supper. I'd like us to build our study around two major headings this morning. We'll look at the momentous meeting, and then secondly, the mysterious Melchizedek. Firstly then, the momentous meeting. Do you remember the scene where we have seen this previously? In Genesis chapter 14, Lot has been captured by the invading forces by 4 foreign kings. And when word gets to Uncle Abram about what has happened to his nephew, to Lot, Abram gathers his ragged band of servants. He forms his little army, and with the odds of Gideon, he goes in pursuit of the enemy. And as we've seen previously, God gives Abram all the wisdom, God gives him all the strength he needed to defeat this large enemy. And Abram comes home victorious. Pick up the story, if you would. Look back with me in Genesis 14 at verse 16. Where it says, so he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah, that is, the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. And we could well imagine, could we not, that not only the king of Sodom goes out to meet him before he even gets back there. Not only the king of Sodom, Berean, gets there in the valley of Shavah and has this meeting, but we could well imagine surely a great crowd of people had come from Sodom, or maybe even that surrounding region, which had been liberated by Abram. Surely a grateful group of people, grateful citizens, had come to welcome the returning and victorious warrior that Abram appeared to them to be. He'd gone into a tough battle on their behalf. And he achieved a resounding victory over the enemy nations. And it's as Moses is describing this scene, it's as if as he's describing that scene with the king of Sodom, there in verse 17, it's like he gets interrupted by this abrupt arrival of this other king, Melchizedek. We're told in verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He's called the king of Salem. That town, that city, was, it seems, just opposite the valley of Shavar. And most commentators agree, and I believe there's clear reason to think that it could be the case, that this town, Salem, is the very place that later on in Bible history becomes known as Jerusalem. You think of the word Jerusalem. It's got Salem in the very name. It's in the very spot where Jerusalem later was established. It's not Jerusalem yet. It's got to be many hundred years before it becomes Jerusalem. But at this point, it's this town of Salem. This is where Melchizedek is king. And Moses pauses then for a moment, and he gives to us this momentous meeting between Abram and this king, Melchizedek. Melchizedek comes out, it says there, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He comes to refresh Abram. Remember where Abram's being? Remember where Abram's heading? He is on his way home. And it says he brought out bread and wine to him. So here is Melchizedek, this king. He's giving a token of his love. He's giving a token of assistance to Abram. You remember how far he's had to travel, Abram? He's had to go some 300 kilometers in terms of his walk back from where he had to have that fight and where he chased those troops to, all the way down south and back towards where he had come from. No doubt he needed refreshment. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, comes to this weary warrior to refresh him, and he uses bread and wine. So this Melchizedek may be a king, but can you not see he also comes out to Abram as a servant? So we see a characteristic of the kingship of Melchizedek is service. In other words, Melchizedek is a servant king. He points us to the Lord Jesus Christ, who is a king, King Jesus, but he is the servant king. And Moses then describes Melchizedek. It's more than just a king. He goes on in the second half of verse 18 and he says, he was the priest of God Most High. So there is the blending of these two offices of priest and king. Never again in Old Testament history, never again until Jesus Christ do we find the mixture of the office of a priest and a king in one person. We find plenty of kings through Old Testament history. We find plenty of priests. We find plenty of prophets. But this is a unique combination of a priestly king. And some would even say, yes, even a prophet, because of his declaration of what he says in verses 19 and 20. But clearly, as is stated in verse 18, he is a priestly king. So Melchizedek is a very significant figure in the history of the pages of the Bible. And that's why this is a momentous meeting. These are important leaders, even as we think of the Bible, even as we think of redemptive history. You'll notice now what this priest of God Most High does in verse 19. He blesses Abram. It says, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And not only does Melchizedek bless Abram, but can you also see with me that Melchizedek is actually worshipping the God of Abram, who is evidently then his God? The one that Abraham worshipped is the very one that Melchizedek here is worshipping in these verses. He is acknowledging God and he's acknowledging him as the God Most High. He is the God, he acknowledges in verse 20, who has just given the victory to Abram. So it's by God's grace, he's saying it's in God's strength that Abram was able to subdue such a strong enemy. He was outnumbered. Like I said, the odds of Gideon, 300 odd, against 4 nations with their armies. And yet, as is acknowledged by what Melchizedek says in verse 20, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, Abram. How fascinating that God had preserved this man, Melchizedek. It's fascinating when we think of the context, as we've begun to look at this in recent weeks, the context of the region of where they lived and what the people were like in those nations around them. It's in the context of all this pagan darkness and heathen idolatry in that region. And here is a man that God in his grace has raised up. A man who now openly, unashamedly confessed the God Most High as being the possessor of heaven and earth. And remember, according to verse 17, he does it in the presence of a pagan king. He does it in the very presence of the king of Sodom. And perhaps many other people around him on that day. Moses then shows us Abram's response to this momentous meeting, his part in this whole meeting in verse 20. Right at the end, it's just a little thing said by Moses, but I believe it's significant. And he says, and he, that's a reference to Abram, gave him a tithe, gave to Melchizedek a tithe of all. Now, it's sometimes debated by the commentators, well, a tithe of all. What's that? A tithe of all that he had at home? Or did he dare to tithe the thing that he just received when he got all that spoil from his victory? I struggle sometimes when you read those commentators and think, well, why don't they just go to another part in the Bible that answers that question? Because Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 4 clarifies the giving of the tithe, and it says this, Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. God had given this great victory to Abram. God had prospered him. God had blessed him. And his response is to give. In particular, he gives a tithe. He gives 1/10 of the spoils. We don't know how much that was, but I would suggest that was a very large amount. This is the first time the tithe is mentioned in the Bible. The tithe, if you like, it's an expression of faith in response to God's blessing. That's what it is here. That's what he's doing here. He's responding to God's blessing to him, and he gives a tithe. Now, as we look at this and as we think of this, we need to keep in our mind, as we are reading Genesis, we need to keep in our mind the time frame of Bible history. This was at a time that was 500 years before the establishment of the Mosaic covenant. And in the Mosaic covenant, the tithe takes on other dimensions in relation to the tribe of Levi and their priestly function in the nation and along with other things. But here, prior to the establishment of the Old Covenant, what is the man of faith doing? The man of faith is giving a tithe, that which, by the way, Jacob also does some years later in response to God's blessing for him, as is recorded in Genesis chapter 24. And here Abram responds to these words of Melchizedek with an expression of thanks. It's a tangible expression. It's not just words. Though there no doubt are words and there's something that's happening in his heart, but there's a practical thing he's doing. He's recognizing that this recent victory in the warfare was God's doing. And his giving, if you like, was an expression of faith. It's not a congratulation of what a great war that I've just won. It's an expression of faith that this was God's doing. This was against all odds. This was not in any way something that a military advisor would have suggested you get into. It was an expression of faith that God is the possessor not only of heaven, not only of earth, but God is the possessor of all that I have. I wonder, can you see here that what's going on in this meeting in one way points us to the elements of worship. This is an event of worship. You think. We have a priest here. What's a priest do? He's a mediator between God and man. We have words of blessing here. We have praise offered to God here. We have prophetic words given here. We see a heart of submission here. We see respect displayed by Abram because he defers to the priestly king. And there's the giving of a tithe, this portion of the booty so recently secured. There's an expression of faith here. There's gratitude here. There's love here. Moses presents to us here Abram as a worshipping believer in the presence of a priest king. It's not Abraham worshipping God privately, though no doubt he did that on way back home. He's gathered with others. And we have every reason to be thinking that Lot, his nephew, remember his brother in grace also, is with him. They've come out to meet him from the town of Sodom. He hasn't got home yet. We see in this story as it unfolds then the blending of two major activities in the child of God. Warfare and worship. Remember where Abram's just come from. He's just come from a battle. He's been engaging in warfare. And he shows us something of the life of faith. Living the Christian life in God's strength and conquering the forces that threaten the honour of God. That's our duty. And the New Testament, as we know, repeatedly describes the Christian as a soldier of Jesus Christ. We're called to fight the good fight of faith. No, not in our own strength. We know that. It's in God's strength. And yet our warfare, it's not exactly the same as Abram's, is it? Our warfare is not against flesh and blood. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. They're not things in the flesh, he says, but they're mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. Hebrews 7, we read before, tells us that Abram physically slaughtered the kings. It doesn't actually come out in this passage here in Genesis 14, but it says it in verse 1, I think it was, in Hebrews 7. He physically slaughtered those kings, or those men under his oversight at least. That was his warfare. But our warfare, it's not a call to military arms. We don't have some jihad. There's a physical warfare. That's not what Christians are called to. But it is a warfare. It's a spiritual warfare. It is a real warfare. Though it may not be physical, it is a real thing. We have to do battle with satanic forces. But not just that. We must also fight against sin. We must be warring against the flesh. Warfare. And when God in His grace gives us the strength and we experience victories, well, then we come and we worship. Yes, privately we praise our God who gives us those victories. But like Abram, we can come to give thanks and honour God who delivered us from our enemies. And we can meet with other saints to worship. That's the pattern of Christian living. Warfare and worship. Warfare and worship. Fighting with remaining sin. Fighting with those evil hosts. In God's strength and by the things that He equips us with, as He says, Paul says in Ephesians 6. And then gathering with God's people in order to express our thanks, war and worship. Worship being the expression of our total reliance upon God. It's an expression of faith. We come with a spirit of humility and gratitude and freely offer to God, yes, even of our material provision. We offer to God from the abundance of His generous provision to us even as we've seen Abraham giving the tithe of all the spoils to Melchizedek. Melchizedek, remember, being God's representative, the priest of God Most High. So as momentous for us as Australians in our history, as momentous as the 2nd of September in 1945 was for the whole Pacific region with the ending of the war with Japan, and as important as regular meetings maybe of our leaders in our country, perhaps in the Parliament in Canberra, as prominent as those leaders and as important as those meetings might be, friends, there is no more significant event, no more important business that happens than when God's people meet to worship their God, even in the presence of our great priestly King, who, remember, Revelation says, who walks amongst his people by his Spirit. We look to the Lord for the strength to be overcomers in our battle with remaining sin and spiritual forces. And then we come together with other returning soldiers to worship together. Our momentous meeting. Warfare and worship. The second thing I want us to think about now is the mysterious Melchizedek. Probably some of you like a good mystery story. I wonder why that is. I wonder what you find so intriguing about a mystery. What makes a mystery tantalizing is because certain details are withheld in the story. You are left guessing. You are left wondering. You are left pontificating and thinking about what you are not told. And there is certainly much mystery surrounding this character Melchizedek, because many details are left hidden from us. Now we need to understand that that's not a mistake. That is not an oversight by Moses. As he writes this, the Spirit of God is leading him, directing him, inspiring these words. The Spirit deliberately holds back the information from us, and hence there is mystery. And it's this mystery that it's in this mystery that Melchizedek fulfills a unique role. He has a function in the Bible to point us forward, to point us to Christ. And the way this prefiguring occurs itself is significant. The way that he bursts onto the scene in this narrative is significant. The fact that there is no record of his family or his background, it is significant. It's part of what the Spirit of God uses to show to us how this man is a type of Christ. Now turn with me, please, to that other passage in Hebrews as we go now and look at what this says in Hebrews chapter 7. And let's read again those first few verses. Hebrews 7 verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the God of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, did the same mistake again. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, Melchizedek was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Now the bigger picture of what the writer to the Hebrews is seeking to show us is the superiority of the priesthood of Jesus Christ. So when we compare Aaron, when we compare the Levitical priesthood to Christ's priesthood, he's bringing us to see the conclusion is that Jesus' priesthood is superior to all those others. His priesthood, Christ's priesthood, was in line with this mysterious priesthood of Melchizedek. Melchizedek pointed to Christ. And effectively he says to us in this passage, think about his name. In verse 2 he tells us something of this. First being translated King of Righteousness, then also King of Salem. He says, if you don't know what Salem means, well, it means King of Peace. So the reign of this priest-king is marked by two chief things: righteousness and peace. Righteousness and peace were the dominating characteristics of the reign of Melchizedek. And those things point us to Christ and his kingdom. We sang at the outset of our service this morning from Psalm 72, a messianic psalm. Speaking of Christ, Jesus shall reign wherever the sun. Well, in Psalm 72, speaking about Messiah's day, it says, the righteous shall flourish, an abundance of peace, until the moon is no more. There will be a flourishing of righteousness in his kingdom. There will be the abundance and abiding of peace in the Messiah's kingdom. So the kingdom of Christ, under his reign, righteousness and peace are dominating characteristics. We know, don't we, how the Old Testament spoke about Christ in prophetic ways. He's called the Prince of Peace by Isaiah. That the increase of his government, that the increase of his reign and peace, there will be no end. Jeremiah, looking forward to Messiah's reign, says in Jeremiah 23, the king shall reign and prosper. He shall execute righteousness in the earth. He will be called the Lord our righteousness. And all through the Old Testament there was this expectation that when God's Saviour comes, he will establish a kingdom which will be marked by righteousness and peace. And this mysterious character, Melchizedek, stands as a type of Christ. He stands out there in this ancient history way back in Genesis 14 as prefiguring what the kingdom of Christ would be and would continue to be for all time. The very name Melchizedek means King of Righteousness. The very place in where he reigned, Salem, means peace. In verse 3 in Hebrews chapter 7 it says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. In Genesis 14, as we've seen, Moses, guided by the Spirit, deliberately passes over the normal details of a person's family and background. He simply presents Melchizedek as bursting onto the scene and then seemingly disappearing from the scene completely. After verse 20, he's gone. He's there in verse 18, there in verse 19, there in verse 20, and then he's gone from the narrative, never to appear again. David speaks about him hundreds of years later. I think it's 900 years later. He speaks about him, but in reference to looking forward to Christ's coming. And of course then, thousands of years after originally that he came, Hebrews here speaks about him. And as you'll see, if you guide your eye down through chapter 7, if your Bible puts the quotes, and you can see the quotations in the Old Testament, there's a quote about Melchizedek, but that's coming from what David wrote about in Psalm 110. When it comes to this narrative here in Genesis 14, we see that this is something really intriguing. There's real mystery here, because we're left wondering due to what we are not told. And it's this very issue that Hebrews 7:3 picks up for us to show to us that this is, in a way, why we can say he's a type of Christ. But you notice the language of verse 3 where it says, but he's made like the Son of God. The point that is being made in Hebrews 7 is that Christ's priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. To the priesthood that came down through Aaron, through the tribe of Levi. Christ's priesthood is in the line of Melchizedek, not Aaron's. That's the point that's being made in Hebrews 7. Though Jesus does have a line, doesn't he? He can be traced in a genealogy because that's what the Gospels do. That's what Matthew does. That's what Luke does. He does have a genealogy. We can trace him. But Jesus is more than a man. He is the Son of God. And Melchizedek points us to Christ. Verse 4 in Hebrews 7 goes on to show us that Melchizedek's superiority is stated clearly to Abram there. It says, now consider how great this man was, how great Melchizedek was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham, gave a tenth of the spoils. He's writing to Hebrews. They look back with a high esteem. Who more could they esteem than the patriarch Abraham, the father of the nation, the father of the faithful? He said, oh, there's one greater than him, Melchizedek. How do we know he's greater than him? Because Abraham comes and he gives a tithe to Melchizedek. Abraham was blessed by Melchizedek. And you look at verse 7, that's the point he picks up. He says, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Abram's been blessed by the better, by the greater. So Melchizedek was greater than Abram, evident by who he is blessed, who blessed who, and who gave the tithe to who. So these verses then, as we don't have time, but they go on to present the argument about the people needing to give a tithe to the Levites under the Mosaic covenant. The Levites came from Abram's loins. The Levites, if you like, are descendants from Abram. But here is Melchizedek, and he's showing to us that Melchizedek is superior to Abram. Because Abram gave a tithe to Melchizedek. Abram is blessed by Melchizedek. So any priest then that comes according to this line of Melchizedek, he's going to have a superior priesthood. And we know, don't we, that Jesus was not born into the tribe of Levi at all as a priest. He came from Judah. You see, his line is not in the line of Aaron. His line as a priest is connected with Melchizedek. That's the whole point that he is making. His priesthood is not temporary. His priesthood is forever. And Hebrews 7 quotes that very point when it quotes Psalm 110 in verse 17 and in verse 21. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So what are we trying to say? What is this saying to us? Well, this mysterious figure Melchizedek serves the function of pointing us to Christ. He has this unique mixture of priest and king. The marks, remember, of his kingdom are righteousness and peace. These things point to Christ. His abrupt appearance onto the stage gives him unusual significance in the light of the deity of Christ. Abram's conduct toward him in the giving of tithe sets him aside. Abram defers to him. Abram submits and receives the blessings that he bestows upon him as a priest king. Melchizedek stands for Christ. Abram stands for true worshipping believer who submits to the priestly King Jesus. And what blessings are bestowed upon those who, like Abram, are recipients of the heavenly blessings? Well, you think we just mentioned a couple. The blessings of Christ's everlasting kingdom are the forgiveness of sins. The forgiveness of sins through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It's also the blessings, therefore, of having access to the Father through the Son, through the great priestly King, the eternal fulfillment of all of God's promises. The whole point of Hebrews 7 is not to exalt Melchizedek, friends. It's not to satisfy our curiosity about the mystery. That's not the point. You may want to talk to me about this later. In the end, it's not the point about Melchizedek. That's not the point. The point is that this whole focus here in Hebrews and in chapter 7 is to exalt Christ, is to show that Christ is superior, that Jesus' priesthood is superior to all others. His is an everlasting priesthood, unlike the Levites. Jesus didn't have to give up or retire when he turned 50, as they did. Now the fact is Jesus died, but he rose again, and he continues to live, and he continues to function as a priest. Still in Hebrews 7, look now as we finish at the end of the chapter, verse 23. He goes on to make these very points. Also there were many priests that came through the line of Aaron, because they were prevented by death from continuing. But he, Christ, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Jesus' priesthood continues right to this very day, right to this very moment. Verse 25, he says, therefore, he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. He's functioning as a priest. He's the go-between, as it were. He's the one that's there on our behalf, because we can't by ourselves and in ourselves approach God. We need to go through Christ. He continues to function. The Levitical priesthood repeatedly had to offer sacrifices, but not with Christ, because his sacrifice was sufficient to atone for sin. That's verse 27. He says, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own and then for the people's. For this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. This is a unique thing about the priesthood of Christ. He is priest, and he is sacrifice. He offered up himself. And friend, as we come to the Lord's table this morning, we come to remember that fact, that Jesus offered up himself, and that he did this once for all. That it doesn't happen every time we have the Lord's Supper, as some. It's happened once for all, because he, when it came to his sacrifice that he offered up, it was accepted by the Father. If you jump over to chapter 9, and we finish here in Hebrews, and verse 12, he says, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of heifers, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And friends, we know Christ has given to us this little memorial feast that we're about to partake on. He's given us this little feast to help us remember him. And can I submit to you, he's also done it to help us be refreshed spiritually. You see, the Lord's Supper in a wonderful way refreshes battle-weary saints who are on their way home. Remember the scene with Abram, the warrior? He was on his way home. And Melchizedek comes to meet him there. What does he do? He refreshes him. What did Melchizedek bring? You remember the passage in Genesis? Moses records the King of Peace brought out bread and wine. Isn't that interesting? I'm not sure about you, but I can't look at that scene in my mind without at least thinking about the Lord's Supper. Now, I don't think it's the main point with that reference at all, and we need to be careful that we don't misuse the passage. But I can't help to think about the bread and the wine that Jesus instituted for his disciples. The King of righteousness, the King of peace, what's he do? He comes out with bread and wine to fellowship with Abram, the believing man, in Genesis 14. He came to refresh the battle-weary believer on his long journey home. Remember, he wasn't home yet, and we're not home yet as believers either, are we? Our home being heaven, of course. Christ, the Lord our righteousness, the great Prince of Peace, in his great kindness, has instituted for us this feast, knowing that we too will forget Jesus and we need the help to remember him, and also knowing that we too need refreshing. Especially we come from real warfare that we are called to engage in. Sometimes we just get weary, don't we? We can come then to this table to remember Christ, our great high priestly King. We can come to this table to fellowship, to have communion with Christ. But it's on another level, because it's an ordinance of the church. It's not for individuals. It's for gathered disciples, so that we can have communion, we can have fellowship with brothers and sisters in Christ, our fellow soldiers of Christ, who, like us, who still are on their journey home, and like us, need to be refreshed from time to time in spiritual things. Well, may God be pleased to bless then this feast of bread and wine to the refreshment of our souls today, and to help us remember not Melchizedek. He's helpful only because he helps us remember Christ. To remember him, that's why Jesus instituted this, that we may remember our blessed Lord Jesus. Well, let's pray. Let's ask now God to bless his word before we come